She warned him with blood still fresh on her hands, her voice breaking under the weight of terror. "You shouldn't be here. They murder anyone who helps me." But Etu Strongbow, the exiled Blackfoot warrior with nothing left to lose, looked into her haunted eyes and made a choice that would either redeem his cursed past or bury them both in the unforgiving dirt of the Montana Badlands. The wind came down from the mountains like something with teeth sharp and cold, cutting across the broken land where sagebrush clung to rocky soil and the sky stretched endless and indifferent. It was the kind of wind that made men pull their coats tight and horses stamp nervous in their traces, the kind that carried the scent of snow even in early autumn. Out here, miles from any town worth naming, the land remembered older things, things that had no place in the new world being carved out by railway steel and gunpowder. Catherine Vale knelt in the dirt beside a creek that had run dry weeks ago, its bed now nothing but cracked mud and scattered stones. Her hands shook as she tried to wash blood from her fingers, but the water she'd carried in a tin canteen was nearly gone, and the blood had dried into the creases of her palms, dark and accusing. Her dress, once a simple blue cotton meant for Sunday church, hung torn at the shoulder, the fabric stained with dust and worse. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, falling in tangled waves around a face that might have been pretty, if not for the bruise spreading purple across her left cheekbone and the hollow, sleepless terror in her eyes. She had been running for 3 days. 3 days since she'd watched them kill Deputy Marshal Thomas Brennan in the street outside the land office in Copper Ridge, his blood pooling black in the dust while townspeople shuttered their windows and pretended not to see. 3 days since she'd made the mistake of screaming, of running to his side, of becoming a witness to murder that powerful men wanted buried. Thomas had been her brother's friend, a good man trying to do right in a territory where right and wrong blurred like heat shimmer on summer stone. He'd been investigating land fraud, following a trail of forged deeds and displaced families that led straight to the Garrison brothers and their network of hired guns. Catherine had been his clerk, keeping his records, filing his reports. She knew too much, and now Thomas was dead and she was marked. The Garrison brothers didn't wear badges or hide in shadows. They owned half the territory through violence and legal theft, buying up land from families too frightened to refuse, forging documents, burning out homesteads, and making sure no lawman lived long enough to challenge them. Vincent Garrison, the eldest, ran the operation from a sprawling ranch house that looked almost respectable if you didn't know about the men buried in the ravine behind it. His brothers, Marcus and Cole, handled the dirty work with a crew of killers who drifted in from Texas and Kansas, men with no names and no mercy. They'd made it clear that anyone who helped Catherine Vale would die screaming. They'd already proven it twice. The first had been old Samuel Chen, who ran a boarding house on the edge of Copper Ridge. He'd given Catherine a room and a warning, told her to leave at first light. The Garrison men came that night, dragged him into the street, and beat him to death with axe handles, while his wife watched from the doorway, too terrified to move. The second had been a drifter named Jack Morley, who'd offered her a horse and directions to the nearest fort. They'd found him 3 miles outside town, hanging from a cottonwood with a sign around his neck that read, "Helper." Catherine had seen the body from a distance, the crows already gathering, and she'd known then that she was poison. Anyone who touched her died, so she ran alone, through the high country where pines grew thick and trails disappeared into stone, through valleys where morning fog clung like ghosts, always moving, always listening for the sound of hooves behind her. She'd lost her shoes on the second day, feet blistered and bleeding, and she'd torn strips from her petticoat to wrap them. Hunger gnawed at her belly, a constant ache she tried to ignore, and thirst was worse, her tongue thick and her lips cracked. She'd found wild berries once, bitter and small, and they'd kept her going for another day. But the Garrisons were still coming. She could feel them, patient and relentless, closing the distance. Now, kneeling by this dead creek in the failing light of late afternoon, Catherine Vale understood that she was going to die out here. The realization came without drama, just a cold, settling certainty. Her body was failing. Her strength was gone. She had no weapon, no food, no plan. The mountains rose around her like indifferent gods, beautiful and merciless, and the wind carried no comfort. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. God felt very far away. That was when she heard the horse. The sound froze her, every muscle locking tight. She lifted her head slowly, scanning the rocky slope above the dry creek bed, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. For a moment, she saw nothing, just the endless sweep of grey stone and scattered juniper. Then movement, a shadow separating from shadows, and a rider emerged from between two boulders 50 yards upslope. He sat his horse like he'd been born to it, moving with the animal rather than against it. And even from a distance, Catherine could see he wasn't like the men hunting her. He wore no hat, his long black hair pulled back and tied with leather cord, and his clothes were a mix of buckskin and worn wool, the kind of practical garments a man wore when he lived between worlds. His face was hard to read from where she knelt, all sharp angles and dark skin weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes found her immediately. And they were the color of river stones, grey and unblinking. Catherine's first instinct was to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She stayed frozen, half crouched beside the dry creek, watching as the rider guided his horse down the slope with careful, deliberate movements. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't drawing a weapon. He simply came on, steady and inevitable, until he was close enough that she could see the details. The rifle in a worn scabbard at his saddle, the knife at his belt, the faint scars that marked his hands and forearms. He looked like violence, but violence held on a tight leash. When he was 20 feet away, he stopped. The horse, a grey mare with intelligent eyes, stamped once and then stood still. The man studied Catherine for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then he spoke in a voice that was low and rough, shaped by a language that wasn't English, but carried its weight easily. "You're the one they're hunting," he said. It wasn't a question. Catherine's throat worked, but no sound came out at first. She tried again, forcing the words past the fear. "Yes," he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already known. His eyes moved over her, taking in the torn dress, the bruised face, the bloody feet wrapped in strips of cloth. There was no pity in his gaze, but no cruelty either. Just assessment, cold and practical. "How many behind you?" "6," she whispered. "Maybe more. They're the Garrison brothers' men. They'll kill you if they find you with me. They kill anyone who helps. I know who they are," the man said, cutting her off. His tone didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been old anger or old pain. Vincent Garrison and his brothers. Land thieves, murderers. They've been bleeding this territory for 5 years. Catherine stared at him, trying to understand. "Then you know what they'll do to you. You need to leave right away. Forget you saw me." The man dismounted in one smooth motion, boots hitting the ground without sound. He moved toward her, and Catherine flinched back instinctively, but he stopped, giving her space. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 40, with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. There was a weariness to him, the kind that came from carrying heavy things for too long. "My name is Itu Strongbow," he said quietly. "I'm Blackfoot, exiled from my people 10 years ago for breaking sacred law." He paused, and for a moment something raw showed in his face. "I failed to protect someone I loved. She died because I wasn't there. I've been wandering ever since, trying to find a reason to stop wandering." Catherine's breath caught. She didn't know what to say to that, didn't know why this stranger was telling her his pain. But he wasn't finished. "I heard about you 3 days ago," Etu continued. "Heard about the deputy marshal they killed, about the woman who witnessed it, about the Garrisons putting a price on your head. I heard about the old man they beat to death for giving you shelter, and the drifter they hanged." His jaw tightened. "I've spent 10 years walking away from people who needed help because I was afraid of failing again. I'm done walking away. They'll kill you," Catherine said, and her voice broke on the words. "They've killed everyone who tried to help me. You don't understand. They're not just outlaws. They own this territory. The law won't touch them. The towns are too scared. You're just one man." Etu looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something unexpected. He smiled, just barely, a ghost of expression that held no joy but something like bitter understanding. "One man is all it takes to make a choice," he said. "I can't save the world. I couldn't even save my wife. But maybe I can save you, and maybe that's enough." Catherine felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she'd built to keep the terror contained. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks, and she couldn't stop them. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you die for me? You don't even know me." "Because 10 years ago I didn't," Etu said simply. "And I've been paying for it every day since." He extended his hand. Catherine stared at it, calloused and scarred, offered without hesitation. She thought about Samuel Chen dying in the street, about Jack Morley swinging from a tree, about every person who'd been touched by her curse. She thought about the Garrison brothers and their killers, about how certain her death had seemed just moments ago. And then she thought about this strange, haunted man who'd ridden out of nowhere with ghosts in his eyes and a choice made. She took his hand. His grip was firm and warm, and he pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness. Her legs shook, threatening to give out, but he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I think so," Catherine managed. Etu nodded and turned toward his horse. He gathered the reins and prepared to help her mount, but Catherine grabbed his arm, stopping him. When he looked back, she met his eyes with desperate intensity. "They're close," she said. "Maybe only a few hours behind. When they find us, they won't give you a chance to surrender. They'll just kill you. Are you sure? Are you really sure you want to do this?" Itu Strongbow looked at her, this broken woman with blood on her hands and death chasing her shadow, and he thought about his wife's face, about the last time he'd seen her alive, about 10 years of wandering and regret. He thought about all the times he'd turned away, all the people he'd left behind because he was afraid to fail again. And he realized that he'd been dead for 10 years, just walking around pretending otherwise. "I'm sure," he said. He helped her onto his horse, swinging up behind her, and turned the grey mare north toward the high country. Behind them, the sun was sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. Somewhere back along the trail, 6 men rode with murder in their hearts and orders to leave no witnesses. Somewhere ahead lay wilderness and uncertain sanctuary. Between those two certainties, Catherine Vale and Etu Strongbow rode together into the gathering dark, both of them marked by death, both of them choosing to fight it anyway. The horse moved at a steady pace through terrain that grew rougher with each mile, picking its way between stone outcroppings and stands of wind-twisted pine. Etu kept the mare to a walk, conscious of Catherine's exhausted state and the need to preserve the animal's strength for what might come. The sun continued its descent, shadows lengthening across the broken land, and the temperature dropped with the kind of suddenness that marked high country autumn. Catherine shivered against his back, her body trembling not just from cold, but from the release of tension she'd held for 3 days straight. "There's a place ahead," Etu said, his voice low and steady. "An old line shack, maybe 2 hours' ride. It's been abandoned for years, but the roof still holds, and there's a spring nearby. We can rest there, tend to your feet." Catherine wanted to protest, wanted to say they couldn't stop, that the garrison men would catch them if they slowed down. But her body betrayed her with a wave of exhaustion so profound she nearly slipped from the saddle. Etu's arm tightened around her waist, steadying her, and she realized that without rest she'd be useless anyway. "How do you know about this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been wandering this territory for 5 years, Etu replied. "Before that, I guided hunting parties, tracked for the army, lived in places most white men never see. I know every line shack, every cave, every water source between here and the Canadian border." He paused. "Knowledge is survival out here. My people taught me that before they cast me out. They rode on through the deepening twilight, the world around them transforming into shapes and shadows. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, its cry lonely and ancient, and Catherine found herself thinking about Thomas Brennan, about how he'd looked at her just before he died. There had been surprise in his eyes and pain, but also something else, something that looked almost like apology, as if he was sorry for dragging her into this mess. "You're thinking about the marshal," Etu said, startling her from her thoughts. "How did you know?" Catherine asked. "I can feel it in the way you're holding yourself," he said. "Grief has weight. I recognize it." He shifted slightly in the saddle. "Tell me about him. Not as a marshal, as a man." Catherine hesitated, then found herself speaking, the words coming easier in the darkness. "He was decent. That's the word I keep coming back to. Just decent. He believed the law meant something, that it could protect people if someone was brave enough to enforce it." Her throat tightened. He was wrong. At least out here he was wrong. "Maybe," Itu said quietly. "Or maybe he just ran out of time. Decency takes longer to build than violence takes to destroy. But that doesn't make it worthless." The line shack appeared gradually out of the darkness, first just a darker shape against dark stone, then resolving into a crude structure of weathered logs, chinked with mud and moss. It sat in a small hollow, protected on three sides by rock formations, invisible from most angles. Etu guided the mare to a stop near what had once been a hitching post. He dismounted first, moving with quiet efficiency, and then helped Catherine down. Her legs nearly gave out when her wrapped feet touched the ground, pain shooting up through her calves and thighs. Etu caught her, supporting her weight until she steadied. "Stay here," he said. "I need to check inside." Catherine nodded. She watched as Etu drew his knife and pushed open the shack's door. It creaked on leather hinges, the sound loud in the mountain quiet. He disappeared inside, and she heard him moving around. After a moment, he emerged. "It's clear," he said. "There's even some old firewood dry enough to burn." He looked at the sky where stars were beginning to emerge. "I'll get a fire going, heat some water. Your feet need attention. What about smoke?" Catherine asked, worry sharpening her voice. "Not if I keep it small and let the rock walls hide the glow," Itu replied. "And we need heat. You're shaking and those feet are infected." His tone was matter of fact, brooking no argument. Inside, Etu built a small fire and warmed water from the nearby spring. Then he turned his attention to Catherine's feet, unwrapping the makeshift bandages with gentle precision. When the cloth came away, Catherine couldn't suppress a sharp breath. Her feet were raw, blistered, several cuts showing angry red infection. "This will hurt," Etu warned. "But it needs to be done." What followed was minutes of careful, painful cleaning. Etu washed her feet thoroughly, then applied salve from a tin he carried. "Made by a Shoshone woman I knew," he explained. "It'll fight the infection." He wrapped her feet in clean cloth, binding them firmly. "Thank you," Catherine whispered. "You're stronger than you think," Etu said. "Most people would have given up. You kept going." He produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, and they ate in companionable silence. When Catherine finished, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. "Sleep," Etu said. "I'll keep watch. They won't come in full dark. Too dangerous in this terrain. We have a few hours." Catherine wanted to argue, but her body pulled her down into darkness. The last thing she saw was Etu by the fire, rifle across his knees, keeping watch over a woman he barely knew, because 10 years ago he'd failed someone he loved. Catherine woke to the smell of coffee, bitter and strong, cutting through the cold mountain air like a promise of warmth. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, her mind still tangled in dreams of running and gunfire. Then awareness returned, with the ache in her feet and the rough texture of Etu's coat still draped across her shoulders. She opened her eyes to find pale dawn light filtering through the cracks in the shack's walls, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Etu sat near the door, his back against the log wall, rifle propped within easy reach. He held a battered tin cup, steam rising from its contents, and his eyes were fixed on the world beyond the open doorway. He looked tired but alert, like a man who'd learned long ago how to function on borrowed strength. When Catherine stirred, he glanced over and something in his expression softened just slightly. "You slept 4 hours," he said quietly. "More than I expected, given everything—" Catherine pushed herself upright, wincing as her wrapped feet protested the movement. The pain was still there, sharp and insistent, but the throbbing heat of infection had dulled. Whatever was in that Shoshone salve, it was working. "You didn't sleep at all," she said, "and it wasn't a question. I'll sleep when we're somewhere safer," Etu replied. He lifted a second tin cup from beside the fire and offered it to her. "Coffee, it's not good, but it's hot." Catherine accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm metal. The first sip was indeed terrible, burnt and grainy, but it sent heat spreading through her chest and cleared some of the fog from her mind. She studied Etu over the rim of the cup, taking in details she'd missed in yesterday's chaos and exhaustion. There were more scars than she'd first noticed, a thin white line along his jaw, another disappearing into his hairline. His hands, wrapped around his own cup, bore the calluses of a man who'd worked with rope and reins and weapons for most of his life. "Tell me about your wife," Catherine said, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Etu's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of old pain rising to the surface. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped some boundary she didn't understand. Then he took a slow sip of his coffee and spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Her name was Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language." He stared into his cup as if reading something written in the dark liquid. "We were married young, maybe too young. I was 20, she was 17. Back then I thought I understood what it meant to protect someone, to keep them safe. I was good with a rifle, good at tracking, good at reading the land. I thought that was enough." He paused, and Catherine waited, sensing that interruption would break whatever fragile willingness had opened in him. "There was a raid," Etu continued. "Crow warriors, angry about hunting territories. It happened while I was away, guiding white trappers through the mountains for money we needed. The elders had told me not to go, said my place was with my people, with my wife. But I thought I knew better. Thought the money mattered more than one man's presence?" His jaw tightened. "I was 3 days' ride away when they came. Ayana tried to hide with the other women and children, but something went wrong. She was found. They killed her, along with 5 others." Catherine's throat constricted. She wanted to say something, offer some comfort, but everything that came to mind felt hollow and inadequate. "When I returned and found her," Etu said, his voice rougher now, "I lost myself. I tracked the Crow raiders, found their camp, and killed 3 men while they slept. It wasn't defense. It wasn't justice. It was rage." He looked up then, meeting Catherine's eyes with something like defiance mixed with shame. "My people have laws about murder, even murder of enemies. What I did was forbidden. The elders exiled me, said I dishonored Ayana's memory by letting anger control me instead of grief. That's not fair," Catherine said, the words coming out more forcefully than she intended. "You were in pain. You lost everything. Fair doesn't matter," Etu replied. "The law exists to keep us from becoming animals. I broke it. The exile was just." He drained the last of his coffee. "But knowing something just doesn't make it easier to carry. For 10 years I've wandered, taking jobs, helping here and there, but never staying. Never letting myself care too much, because caring means failing when things go wrong. And things always go wrong." Catherine absorbed this, understanding now the weight she'd seen in him from the beginning. He wasn't just a man who'd lost his wife. He was a man who believed he deserved that loss, who'd spent a decade punishing himself with isolation. "But you stopped running," she said softly. "Yesterday when you found me, you chose to stop it." "Yes," Etu said simply. "Why?" Catherine pressed. "What changed?" Etu stood, moving to the doorway to look out at the brightening sky. The mountains rose around them, massive and indifferent, their peaks touched with gold from the rising sun. "I saw you kneeling by that dry creek," he said, "and I saw Ayana. Not literally, but the same helplessness, the same certainty of death coming. And I realized I'd been given something I didn't get 10 years ago, a chance to be there, to stand between someone and the darkness. He turned back to face her. Maybe I can't save you. Maybe we both die today. But at least I'll die trying instead of running. The simple honesty of it struck Catherine like a physical blow. This man, carrying a decade of guilt and grief, had chosen her as his redemption. The responsibility of that felt enormous, terrifying, but also strangely strengthening. If he believed she was worth dying for, maybe she was worth fighting for too. Then we'd better not die, she said, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile crossing Etu's weathered face. No, he agreed. We'd better not. He moved to his saddlebag and began checking his supplies with methodical care. Rifle ammunition, knife, length of rope, the half-empty tin of salve. Not much to wage war with, but he handled each item with the focused attention of someone who knew how to make little count for much. The place I mentioned yesterday, Eagle's Rest. We need to reach it before they catch up. It's maybe 3 hours hard ride from here, higher into the mountains where the trees thin out and rock takes over. There's only one approach, and it's steep. Good for defense, and if they catch us before we get there, Catherine asked, then we improvise, Etu said. He looked at her feet, wrapped and slightly less swollen than yesterday. Can you ride? Honestly? Catherine tested her weight, standing carefully. Pain flared but stayed manageable. Yes, I can ride. Good. Etu kicked dirt over the dying fire, erasing evidence of their presence. We leave now. Stay close, stay quiet. If I signal you to hide, you hide and don't argue. Understand? I understand, Catherine said. They moved outside into air so cold it burned Catherine's lungs. The grey mare stood where Etu had picketed her, calm and patient, despite the tension radiating from her owner. Etu saddled quickly, speaking soft words in Blackfoot that seemed to settle the horse even further. Then he helped Catherine mount, his hands steady on her waist as he lifted her into position. He swung up behind her, and they were moving before she'd fully settled, the mare picking her way out of the hollow with careful, deliberate steps. The landscape had transformed overnight. What had been merely rugged yesterday now looked actively hostile. All sharp stone and treacherous scree that could turn an ankle or break a leg with one wrong step. The trail, if it could be called that, wound upward through increasingly sparse vegetation. Bean gave way to twisted juniper to bare rock and patches of hardy grass. The air grew thinner, colder, each breath visible as white vapor that disappeared almost instantly. They'd been riding perhaps an hour when Etu suddenly tensed behind her. His arm tightened around her waist, and the mare slowed to a stop. Catherine felt her heart lurch into her throat. "What?" she whispered. "Quiet," Etu breathed. He was listening, head tilted, every sense focused on something she couldn't perceive. Then she heard it too, faint but unmistakable. Voices, carried on the wind from somewhere below and behind them. Men's voices, rough with exertion and excitement. "They're closer than I thought," Etu murmured. "Must have found the line shack already." He scanned the terrain ahead, calculating. "There's a box canyon about half a mile east. We can cut through it, come out on the other side closer to Eagle's Rest. It'll save time, but it's dangerous. If they follow us in, we'll be trapped, and if we don't?" Catherine asked. "They'll run us down in open ground," Etu said flatly. He made his decision. The canyon. Hold tight. He urged the mare into a faster pace, not quite a run but close, a controlled canter that ate up ground while still watching for hazards. Catherine gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her injured feet bouncing painfully despite the wrappings. Behind them, the voices grew louder, more distinct. She could make out individual words now, crude jokes about what they'd do when they caught up. Speculation about whether the woman would still be alive or if they'd find just a corpse. The canyon mouth appeared suddenly, a narrow cleft in the rock face that looked barely wide enough for a horse. Etu didn't hesitate. He guided the mare into the opening, and the world closed in around them. Walls of stone rose 30 feet on either side, so close Catherine could have reached out and touched them. The path twisted and turned, following some ancient watercourse long since dried up. Hoofbeats echoed off the rock impossibly loud, announcing their presence to anyone within a mile. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They rounded a sharp bend, and Etu cursed, a sharp Blackfoot word that needed no translation. The canyon ahead was blocked by a rockfall, tons of stone that had collapsed from the walls sometime in the recent past. There was no way through. They were trapped! Off, Etu commanded, already dismounting. Now. Catherine slid down, her feet screaming protest as they hit the ground. Etu grabbed the rifle from its scabbard and pressed the mare's reins into Catherine's hands. Take her to the back of the canyon. There's a crack in the wall, narrow but deep. Hide there with the horse. Don't come out no matter what you hear. What are you going to do? Catherine asked, though she already knew. Buy you time, Etu said. He checked the rifle's load, his movements calm despite the urgency of the moment. If I don't come back, wait until dark and try to work your way out on foot. Head north, keep the highest peaks on your left. 3 days walk and you'll hit the mining camps near Silver Creek. Tell them what happened. Make sure someone knows what the garrisons did. Etu, Catherine started, but he cut her off. No time for argument, he said, but his voice was gentler now. You asked me why I'm doing this. This is why. Because someone has to stand. Someone has to say no to men like the garrisons, even if it costs everything. He met her eyes, and she saw no fear there, only resignation mixed with something that might have been peace. Now go, hide. Catherine wanted to protest, wanted to refuse, but the sound of approaching horses left no room for debate. She led the mare deeper into the canyon, finding the crack Etu had mentioned, a narrow split in the rock, barely wide enough for the horse. She coaxed the animal inside, pressing herself against its warm flank, and watched as Etu positioned himself behind a boulder near the canyon's entrance. The first rider appeared moments later, a lean man with a scarred face and a rifle across his saddle. He saw the rockfall and reined in sharply, raising a hand to halt the men behind him. "The canyon's blocked," he called. "They're trapped in here." 5 more riders emerged, spreading out across the canyon mouth. Catherine recognized none of them, but their type was universal. Hard men with dead eyes, the kind who killed for money and felt nothing. The scarred man, clearly their leader, dismounted and drew his pistol. "Come out," he called into the canyon. "We know you're in there. Make it easy and maybe the woman lives." Silence answered him. The men exchanged glances, nervous despite their numbers. One of them, younger than the others with a patchy beard, shifted in his saddle. "Maybe they went over the wall," he suggested, "with a woman who can barely walk." The scarred man snorted. "They're hiding." Spread out, check every... Etu's rifle shot cut him off mid-sentence. The bullet took the young bearded man in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a cry of pain. The other men scattered, diving for cover behind rocks and drawing weapons. The scarred leader cursed viciously and fired blindly into the canyon, his bullets sparking off stone somewhere above Etu's position. What followed was chaos compressed into deadly seconds. Etu fired twice more, methodical and accurate, each shot forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. But Catherine could see the mathematics of the situation as clearly as Etu must have. 1 man with a rifle against 6, limited ammunition, no escape route. He was buying time with his life, spending it bullet by bullet. One of the garrison men, braver or more foolish than the rest, made a dash forward, trying to get closer to Etu's position. Etu's next shot caught him in the leg, and he went down screaming. But the move had done its job, revealing Etu's exact position. The scarred leader saw it and signaled to his men. They began a coordinated advance, 3 men firing to keep Etu pinned, while the other 2 moved to flank his position. Catherine watched in horror, helpless, as the trap closed. Etu fired again, the shot going wide as he was forced to divide his attention between multiple threats. He was going to die. In minutes, maybe seconds, they would overwhelm his position, and it would be over. The man who'd chosen to stand, who'd stopped running after 10 years, would fall in this nameless canyon, and she would be captured, and it would all be for nothing. "No," The word crystallized in Catherine's mind with perfect clarity. She'd spent 3 days running, spent weeks before that keeping her head down and hoping to survive by being invisible. She'd let good men die for her while she did nothing but flee. Thomas Brennan, Samuel Chen, Jack Morley, all dead because they'd tried to help and she'd accepted their help without fighting herself. If Etu Strongbow was going to die here, it wouldn't be alone, and it wouldn't be without her standing beside him. She looked around frantically, searching for anything that could serve as a weapon. Her hand fell on a stone, the size of her fist, rough and heavy. Pathetic against men with guns, but it was something. She picked it up, then grabbed another, filling her pockets with rocks. The mare watched her with liquid brown eyes that seemed almost understanding. At the canyon mouth, the garrison men were closing in. Etu fired his last shot, and Catherine heard the sick click of an empty chamber. The scarred leader heard it too and smiled, cruel and triumphant. "Out of bullets, Indian," he called. "Come out now or we'll drag you out." Etu didn't respond. Catherine saw him draw his knife, that wicked blade with the bone handle, and her heart broke and hardened at the same time. He was going to die fighting. The least she could do was fight with him. She stepped out of the crack in the wall, stone in hand, and screamed with everything she had left. The sound was primal, rage and terror and refusal all mixed together, and it startled the garrison men into momentary stillness. They turned, shocked to see the woman they'd been hunting standing in plain sight, armed with nothing but rocks and fury. The scarred leader's eyes widened in surprise that quickly turned to vicious amusement. "Well," he said, "look who found some courage." Catherine threw the stone with all her strength. Her aim was wild, unpracticed, but luck or providence guided it true. The rock caught the scarred man square in the forehead, and he staggered back, blood streaming from a split above his eye. The other men froze, stunned by the audacity of it. And in that moment of hesitation, Etu moved. Etu exploded from behind the boulder like something unleashed, his knife already in motion before the garrison men could recover from their shock. He covered the distance to the nearest attacker in 3 long strides, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. The blade found flesh before the man could raise his pistol, driving up under the ribcage with surgical precision. The attacker made a wet, choking sound and collapsed, his weapon clattering uselessly on stone. The scarred leader was still reeling from Catherine's thrown rock, blood in his eyes, cursing and wiping at his face with one hand while trying to aim his pistol with the other. Etu didn't give him the chance. He closed the distance and struck with the knife again, this time cutting across the man's gun hand. The pistol fired wild, the bullet singing off canyon walls. And then the weapon was falling, and the scarred man was stumbling backward, clutching his ruined hand and screaming. 2 of the remaining men finally broke from their paralysis and opened fire. Bullets sparked off rock inches from Etu's head as he dove behind a fallen boulder, rolling and coming up in a crouch. Catherine saw him assess the situation with that same cold calculation she'd witnessed before, saw him recognize what she already knew. They were still outnumbered, still outgunned, and now he'd spent his element of surprise. But something had changed in the air, some shift in the balance of power that Catherine could feel even if she couldn't name it. The garrison men were no longer hunting prey. They were facing something that fought back, something dangerous, and the easy confidence they'd carried into the canyon had cracked. The man Etu had stabbed lay motionless in a spreading pool of blood. The scarred leader was on his knees, his gun hand useless, his face a mask of shock and pain. And Catherine Vale, the helpless woman they'd been sent to kill, had just split open their leader's skull with a rock. One of the remaining attackers, a heavy-set man with a thick black beard, made the mistake of standing too high while trying to get a clear shot at Etu. Catherine's second thrown stone caught him in the throat. It wasn't a killing blow, but it struck his windpipe hard enough to send him gagging and choking, his rifle swinging wide as he clutched at his neck. Etu took the opening. He came around the boulder low and fast, closing with the choking man before his companions could adjust their aim. The knife flashed once, twice, and the bearded man went down in a heap. 3 dead now, or dying, and the mathematics of the fight had shifted dramatically. The 2 remaining attackers broke. Catherine saw it happen, saw the moment when survival instinct overrode orders and payment and pride. They were scrambling backward toward their horses, firing wildly to cover their retreat, no longer trying to kill, but simply trying to escape. The scarred leader, still on his knees and cradling his mangled hand, shouted at them to stand and fight, but his voice was weak, thready with shock and blood loss. Etu let them go. He stood in the center of the canyon, chest heaving, knife dripping red, and watched the 2 riders flee with their wounded leader draped across one saddle. He didn't pursue, didn't waste ammunition on parting shots. He simply stood there, a man who'd just killed 3 others in brutal close combat, and let exhaustion wash over him like a wave. Catherine remained frozen where she stood, stone still clutched in her hand, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She'd watched men die before, had seen Thomas Brennan murdered in the street. But this was different. This was violence she'd participated in, blood on her hands in a way that felt terrifyingly literal, even though she'd never touched a blade. She'd thrown those stones. She'd drawn blood. She'd helped kill Catherine. Etu's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He was moving toward her, sheathing the knife, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Catherine, look at me." She did, meeting his grey eyes, and found them surprisingly gentle despite what those eyes had just witnessed, what his hands had just done. "You did well," he said quietly. "You saved my life." "I killed them," Catherine whispered, her voice shaking. "I threw those stones and men died." "No," Etu said firmly. "I killed them. You distracted them. You gave me an opening. There's a difference." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And even if you had killed them, even if your hand had held the knife, it would have been justified. They came here to murder you. Self-defense isn't the same as murder." Catherine wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that simple moral distinction. But her hands were shaking and her stomach was churning, and somewhere in the back of her mind a voice was screaming that she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. She wasn't the same woman who'd knelt by that dry creek yesterday, waiting to die. That woman had been a victim, helpless and innocent. This woman had fought back. This woman had drawn blood. "Breathe," Etu commanded, his hands on her shoulders now, grounding her. "Breathe slow, in and out. You're in shock. That's normal, but we don't have time for you to fall apart right now. Do you understand? We need to move." The practical urgency in his voice cut through Catherine's spiral. She forced herself to breathe, deep and slow, feeling the cold mountain air fill her lungs and clear some of the fog from her mind. Etu was right. They couldn't afford paralysis. 2 of the Garrison men had escaped, which meant Vincent Garrison would know exactly where they were and what had happened. More men would come, and they'd come ready for a fight. "What do we do?" Catherine managed, her voice steadier now. "We take what we need and we run," Etu said. He was already moving, checking the dead men's pockets and saddlebags with efficient, unsentimental thoroughness. Ammunition, food, water, anything useful. He found a rifle, checked its action, and slung it across his back. "And we take their horses. The more animals they have to track, the harder we'll be to follow." Catherine watched him work. This man who just killed 3 people with a knife, and was now looting their corpses with the calm focus of someone gathering firewood. She wondered what kind of life taught a man to switch so seamlessly between violence and practicality, between killing and survival. Then she thought about Ayana, about 10 years of exile and wandering, and understood. Etu Strongbow had learned to do what was necessary because the alternative was death or madness. "Help me," Etu said, and Catherine forced herself to move. She approached the nearest body, trying not to look at the face, trying not to think about the fact that this had been a living person minutes ago. She found a canteen and a pouch of jerky, took both with hands that only shook a little. By the time they'd finished, they had 3 rifles, enough ammunition to sustain a small war, food for several days, and 4 additional horses. He too gathered the reins of the extra horses and tied them in a string, creating a train of animals that could be led by one rider. "We'll take them halfway to Eagle's Rest and then cut them loose," he explained. "Let them scatter. Give the garrisons more trails to follow, more confusion to sort through." He helped Catherine back onto his grey mare, then swung up behind her. "Hold on. We're going to move fast now." They burst out of the box canyon at a controlled run, the string of horses trailing behind like a bizarre cavalry charge. The terrain flew past in a blur of rock and scrub, the cold air burning Catherine's lungs as she clung to the saddle. Behind them, the 3 dead men lay in their blood, testimony to the cost of hunting human prey. Ahead, the mountains rose higher still, their peaks lost in clouds that promised snow. They rode hard for an hour, pushing the horses to the edge of their endurance but not beyond it. It too seemed to have an instinct for what the animals could handle, when to slow and when to press, reading their breathing and gait like a language only he understood. Finally, as they crested a rocky ridgeline that offered a clear view of the country behind them, he called a halt. "We'll cut the extra horses loose here," he said, dismounting and beginning to untie the lead ropes. "Let them find their own way. Some will probably head back toward lower ground, leave tracks in different directions. Buy us time." Catherine slid down from the mare, her wrapped feet protesting but holding. She watched as Etu freed the horses one by one, slapping their rumps to send them trotting off in different directions. Within minutes, the animals had dispersed across the landscape, each one a potential false trail for their pursuers to follow. "Clever," Catherine said. "Necessary," Etu corrected. He turned to survey the terrain ahead, shading his eyes against the morning sun. "Eagle's Rest is maybe 2 more hours from here. The climb gets steeper, rockier. The mare can handle it, but we'll need to go slow, watch every step. Unbroken leg and we're on foot, and on foot we're dead." Catherine followed his gaze, taking in the brutal landscape that awaited them. The mountains here looked less like earth, and more like the bones of the world itself, all jagged stone and sheer faces that seemed to dare anyone foolish enough to climb them. "And once we reach this place," she asked, "what then? We can't stay there forever?" "No," Etu agreed. "But we can stay long enough for the garrisons to make a mistake. Vincent Garrison is rich and powerful, but he's also arrogant. He's used to winning through intimidation and overwhelming force. He's not used to prey that fights back, that thinks, that plans. If we can hold out long enough, make the cost high enough, he might decide you're more trouble than you're worth." "You don't believe that," Catherine said, reading the doubt in his voice. Etu was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I don't. Vincent Garrison can't afford to let you live. You witnessed his men murder a federal marshal. If you make it to a court, to a judge who can't be bought, his whole empire collapses. He'll spend whatever it takes, sacrifice whoever he must to make sure you die." He looked at her then, his expression grave. "But that doesn't mean we give up. It means we fight smarter, make him pay for every inch, make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, the cost is too high." Catherine absorbed this, the brutal honesty of it. They were probably going to die. Etu knew it. She knew it. But they were going to die fighting, die making it hurt, die proving that some people couldn't be hunted down like animals without consequences. There was a grim satisfaction in that, a refusal to submit that felt more valuable than survival itself. "Then let's make it hurt," Catherine said. Something sparked in Etu's eyes, approval or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit. "Yes," he said simply. "Let's." They mounted again and continued their ascent into country that grew increasingly hostile with every mile. The trees disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but rock and patches of hardy lichen that somehow survived in the thin air. The wind picked up, howling through gaps in the stone with a voice that sounded almost human, almost mocking. Catherine's ears popped as they climbed, the pressure changing, the air growing harder to breathe. The path, such as it was, became a series of switchbacks carved into the mountainside, each turn revealing yet another impossible stretch of climbing ahead. The mare struggled now, her breathing labored, foam flecking her neck. Etu walked beside her for long stretches, leading rather than riding, sparing the animal his weight. Catherine did the same when her feet allowed it, gritting her teeth against the pain. They were perhaps halfway to their destination when Etu suddenly stopped, his body going rigid. Catherine felt her own breath catch. She didn't need to ask what was wrong. She could hear it herself now, the distant sound of hooves on stone coming from below. The garrisons hadn't wasted time. They'd regrouped and resumed pursuit, and they were coming fast. "How many?" Catherine whispered. Etu was already scanning the terrain, his tactical mind working. "Hard to say from the sound. At least 6, maybe more. Vincent Garrison himself might be with them now." He pointed to a narrow defile about 100 yards ahead, where the path squeezed between 2 massive boulders. "There, we can make a stand if we have to. Force them to come at a single file, neutralize their numbers' advantage." They hurried forward, the mare sensing their urgency and finding strength despite her exhaustion. They reached the defile just as the first riders came into view far below, dark figures against the pale stone. Etu counted quickly. 8, he muttered. "Maybe 9. Too many." He positioned Catherine behind the larger of the 2 boulders, handed her one of the rifles they'd taken from the dead men. "You know how to use this?" "Uja Thomas taught me," Catherine said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Basic marksmanship. I'm not good, but I can hit a man-sized target at 50 yards. "That'll do," Etu said. He took position behind the opposite boulder, creating a crossfire that would rake anyone trying to force the narrow passage. "Wait for my signal. Make every shot count. And Catherine?" He looked at her across the gap. "If they get through, if I go down, you run. Climb higher. There are caves up near the summit. Hide and wait for dark. Promise me." "I promise," Catherine lied, knowing she'd do no such thing. The riders approached with caution now, aware they were entering terrain that favored ambush. Catherine could see them clearly as they drew nearer. Hard men on hard horses, all carrying rifles, all wearing expressions of grim determination. And at their center, mounted on a black stallion that looked like it had been bred for war, rode a man who could only be Vincent Garrison. He was younger than Catherine had expected, maybe 40, with a handsome face that would have been striking if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. He wore a long coat of fine wool, expensive boots, a hat that probably cost more than most men earned in a month. He looked more like a banker than a killer, which made him somehow more frightening. This was a man who murdered from behind walls of respectability and law. Vincent Garrison raised a hand, halting his men about 70 yards from the defile. He studied the terrain ahead with the eye of someone who'd seen ambushes before, who understood the tactical situation immediately. Then he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air, "Strongbow, I know you're up there. My men told me about you. Blackfoot exile, wandering gun for hire. You've cost me 3 good men and made this personal." He paused. "I'm prepared to make you an offer. Right away now. Take one of the horses, take whatever supplies you need, and disappear. I'll even pay you for your trouble. $500. More money than you'd see in a year of honest work." Etu didn't respond, didn't give away his position. Catherine held her breath, wondering if he was actually considering it. $500 was a fortune. A man could start over with that kind of money, buy land, build a life. Or, Vincent continued, his voice hardening, "you can die here with the woman. And make no mistake, you will die. I have 20 more men riding up behind me. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of mountain. There's nowhere left to run, Strongbow. Take the money and live." For a long moment, silence hung over the mountain like a held breath. Catherine found herself staring at Etu across the gap between their positions, trying to read his face, trying to understand what he was thinking. He'd already done more than anyone could ask. He'd stood when he could have ridden away. He'd fought when he could have fled. If he took the offer now, if he chose to live, she couldn't blame him. Then Etu stood up, exposing himself fully, and Catherine's heart lurched into her throat. But he wasn't surrendering. He was making a statement. He looked down at Vincent Garrison from his high position, rifle held loose in one hand, and when he spoke his voice carried the same calm certainty she'd heard when he'd first offered her his hand. "I've been offered money before," Etu called down. "Been offered safety, comfort, all the things men like you think matter. But I've learned something in 10 years of wandering, Garrison. A man who sells his honor for gold has nothing left worth buying." He shifted the rifle slightly, not quite a threat, but close. "The woman stays with me. You want her? You'll have to come through me. And I promise you, the price will be higher than you want to pay." Vincent Garrison's face darkened. Even from this distance, Catherine could see rage twisting his handsome features into something ugly. "You're a fool, Strongbow. A dead fool." He turned to his men. "Kill them both. I want the woman's body brought to me. As for the Indian, leave him for the wolves." The first shot cracked out before Vincent finished speaking, one of his men firing too eagerly. The bullet sparked off stone 3 feet from Etu's position. Etu dropped back into cover and returned fire in one smooth motion, his shot taking the eager man in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The other riders scattered, dismounting and seeking cover. And suddenly the mountain was alive with the sound of gunfire. Catherine pressed herself against the boulder, heart hammering, rifle clutched to her chest. Bullets whined overhead, ricocheting off stone with sounds like angry hornets. She could hear Etu firing methodically, spacing his shots, making each one count. She forced herself to lean around her boulder, found a target, a man trying to advance up the slope, using a line of rocks for cover. She aimed, breathed out, squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the shot going wide, kicking up dust 2 feet to the left of her target. But it was close enough to make the man dive flat, to disrupt his advance. Catherine worked the bolt, chambered another round, fired again. This time she was closer, close enough that the man decided retreat was wiser than advance. The firefight settled into a brutal rhythm. The garrison men would try to advance. Etu and Catherine would drive them back with rifle fire. They'd regroup and try again. Minutes stretched into an hour, ammunition dwindling on both sides. Catherine lost count of how many times she'd fired, how many near misses she'd scored. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, her ears rang from the constant crack of gunfire. Then Etu's rifle clicked empty. Catherine heard it, a sound somehow louder than all the shooting. She looked across the gap and saw him reaching for the second rifle, the one he'd taken from the dead men. But before he could bring it up, 3 of the garrison men made a coordinated rush, using the moment of silence to close the distance. They came fast, experienced fighters who knew how to use terrain and timing. Etu fired once with the second rifle, dropped 1 man, but the other 2 reached the defile before he could cycle the bolt. They were through the bottleneck, inside the defensive position, and suddenly everything was chaos. Etu dropped the rifle and drew his knife in one fluid motion, meeting the first attacker before the man could raise his pistol. They collided in a tangle of limbs and desperation, rolling across the rocky ground, in a struggle that was more brawl than combat. The second man wheeled toward Catherine, his revolver coming up, and she acted on pure instinct rather than thought. She swung the rifle like a club, the wooden stock connecting with his gun hand just as he fired. The shot went wild, the bullet singing off into empty air, and then Catherine was swinging again, this time catching him across the jaw with enough force to send him staggering backward. But the blow cost her. The rifle's stock cracked from the impact, the weapon now useless for anything but a bludgeon. The man she'd hit recovered faster than she'd hoped, spitting blood and raising his pistol again with murder in his eyes. Catherine had nowhere to go, no cover close enough to reach. She was going to die here, shot down like an animal after everything she'd survived. A shot cracked out, but it wasn't the man's pistol. It came from behind Catherine, from higher up the mountain, and the man with the raised gun jerked once and fell, a red stain spreading across his chest. Catherine spun, confused, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Someone else was shooting. Someone else was here. On a rocky outcrop 30 yards above their position stood a woman, tall and lean, dressed in buckskin and wool with long dark hair whipping in the mountain wind. She held a rifle that still smoked from the shot that had saved Catherine's life. And as Catherine watched in stunned disbelief, the woman worked the bolt and fired again, this time at one of the garrison men who was trying to flank Etu's position. The man dove for cover, his advance disrupted. Etu had subdued his opponent, the man now lying unconscious or dead on the ground. He looked up at the woman on the outcrop, and something passed across his face, an expression Catherine couldn't quite read. Recognition, certainly, but also surprise and something that might have been old pain. "Takoda," Etu called up, his voice rough. The woman on the outcrop smiled, fierce and bright. "Hello, little brother. You look like you could use help, little brother." The words clicked into place in Catherine's mind. This woman was Blackfoot, had to be, and she'd called Etu little brother. Family, then, or the closest thing to it in a culture Catherine barely understood. But there was no time for questions, because below them, the garrison men were regrouping. Vincent's voice sharp with fury as he ordered them to advance again. Takoda descended from her perch with the agility of someone who'd spent her life in mountains. She reached their position in seconds, taking cover behind the same boulder that had been sheltering Catherine. Up close, Catherine could see she was perhaps 35, with a face marked by weather and hardship, but still striking in its sharp-boned beauty. Her eyes were the same grey as Etu's, that distinctive riverstone colour that seemed to see through pretense to truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "How many?" Takoda asked, her English accented but clear. 8 left, maybe 9, Etu replied, crouching beside them. "Vincent Garrison himself is down there. Rich man playing at war." Takoda spat over the boulder's edge, a gesture of profound contempt. "Rich men always think gold makes them warriors." "How much ammunition?" "Running low," Etu admitted. "Maybe 20 rounds between us." "I have 30, Takoda said, patting the ammunition pouch at her belt. "And I brought something else." She reached into her pack and produced 3 bundles wrapped in oilcloth. When she unwrapped them, Catherine saw they were dynamite sticks, old but well-preserved, the kind miners used to blast through rock. Etu's eyebrows rose. "Where did you get those?" "Traded for them in Silver Creek," Takoda said with a grin that was equal parts mischief and menace. "Figured they might be useful." "Looks like I was right." She looked past Etu to Catherine, studying her with frank curiosity. "So this is the woman worth dying for?" Catherine felt herself flush under that direct gaze. "I'm Catherine Vale. I didn't ask him to die for me." "No one ever does," Takoda said, but there was no judgment in her voice, only understanding. "I'm Takoda Whitehorse, Etu's cousin. I've been tracking him for 3 days, ever since I heard he'd finally stopped running." She glanced at Etu. "The elders sent word. They want you to come home." Etu's face went very still. "I was exiled." "There is no home. Exile can be ended," Takoda said quietly. "Old Runs with Elk is dying. Before he goes, he wants to lift the sentence. Says 10 years is enough, that you've paid your debt." She touched his arm, a gesture of surprising gentleness from someone who looked so fierce. "But first we have to survive this. So let's kill these white men and their rich leader, and then we can talk about going home." Below them, the garrison men were preparing for another assault. Catherine could see them gathering behind cover. Vincent Garrison directing them with hand signals, organizing them into proper attacking formation. They'd learned caution from their casualties, but they hadn't learned retreat. The dynamite changed everything. With those sticks properly placed, the narrow defile could become a death trap. "I'll set the charges," Etu said, already reaching for the dynamite. "No," Takoda interrupted. "You're exhausted. You've been fighting all morning." "I'm fresh." She gathered the sticks and began preparing them with practiced efficiency, shortening fuses, binding them together for maximum effect. "Besides, I'm faster than you were even when you were young." Etu looked like he wanted to argue, but Catherine saw him recognize the truth in his cousin's words. He was running on fumes, adrenaline and stubbornness holding him upright. Dakota was right. She was the better choice for what needed to be done. The narrow spot where the trail squeezes between the rocks, Itu said, pointing. Set them there. When the charge goes, it'll bring down enough stone to block the path completely. And anyone caught in the blast, Dakota added grimly. She finished her preparations and tucked the bundled dynamite under her arm. Cover me! If I don't make it back, tell my daughter I died brave. You have a daughter? Catherine asked, surprised. Dakota's smile softened. 12 years old and meaner than a cornered wolverine. She's with my sister in the winter camp. The smile faded. If I die here, Itu will make sure she knows her mother fought well. Won't you, cousin? You're not going to die, Itu said flatly. No, Dakota agreed. I'm not. Then she was moving, low and fast, using every scrap of cover as she worked her way toward the defile. Itu and Catherine provided suppressing fire, forcing the garrison men to keep their heads down while Dakota made her dangerous run. Catherine watched in awe as the Blackfoot woman moved across terrain that would have killed her in seconds. Dakota seemed to flow from rock to rock, never exposing herself for more than a heartbeat, reading the landscape like a language Catherine couldn't even begin to comprehend. She reached the defile and began setting the charges, working with calm precision, despite bullets occasionally sparking off stone nearby. She's incredible, Catherine breathed. She's the best scout our people ever produced, Itu said, pride evident in his voice despite the tension. When we were children, she could track a grasshopper through tall grass. The army tried to hire her as a guide. She told them she'd rather eat rocks. Below, Vincent Garrison had finally noticed what was happening. His shout of alarm carried clearly up the mountain. The woman by the rocks, stop her! She's setting charges. The garrison men shifted their fire, concentrating on Dakota's position. Catherine saw rock chips fly as bullets struck all around the crouching woman. But Dakota didn't rush, didn't panic. She finished placing the dynamite with methodical care, struck a match to light the shortened fuse, and then she was running back toward them with bullets chewing up the ground at her heels. Down! Itu shouted, dragging both women behind the largest boulder as the fuse burned shorter. The explosion was enormous, a thunderclap of sound and fury that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Catherine felt the shockwave hit like a physical blow, hot air washing over them, debris pattering down like deadly rain. When the smoke cleared enough to see, the narrow defile had been transformed. What had been a passable trail was now a jumbled mass of broken stone, tons of rock brought down from the walls above. And somewhere in that chaos were the screams of men caught in the blast. Itu raised his head cautiously, assessing the damage. 3 of the garrison men had been caught directly in the explosion, their bodies broken and buried under stone. 2 more were wounded, crawling away from the rockfall with blood streaming from ears and noses. The survivors, including Vincent Garrison, had retreated down the slope, taking cover behind whatever they could find. Their formation shattered. "That's 7 down," Dakota said, breathing hard but grinning. "How many does that leave?" "At the 3, maybe 4, Itu replied. "Plus Garrison himself." He looked at the blocked trail, nodded approval. "They can't come at us directly now. They'll have to climb around, find another approach." "That buys us time." "Time for what?" Catherine asked. "We're still trapped up here." "No," Itu said, pointing higher up the mountain. "Eagle's Rest is just beyond that ridge. We can reach it in maybe an hour. Once we're there, we'll have water from snowmelt, shelter in the rocks, and a position that's nearly impossible to assault. We can hold out for days if we have to. And then," Catherine pressed, "we can't stay on this mountain forever." Dakota was the one who answered, her expression serious now. "Then we wait for Vincent Garrison to make a choice. He can keep losing men trying to dig us out, or he can cut his losses and retreat. Rich men don't like losing. Eventually, the cost becomes too high." Catherine wanted to believe that, wanted to think that Vincent Garrison would calculate the price of his revenge and decide it wasn't worth paying. But she'd seen the cold fury in his eyes when Itu had refused his offer of gold. This wasn't just about silencing a witness anymore. It was about pride, about power, about a man who couldn't tolerate defiance. Vincent Garrison would burn the whole mountain down before he'd admit defeat. "He won't stop," Catherine said quietly. "Not until we're dead, or he is." Itu and Takoda exchanged a look, some wordless communication passing between them. Finally, Itu nodded. "Then we make sure it's him," he said simply. They gathered what supplies they could carry and began the final climb to Eagle's Rest. The trail grew steeper, more treacherous, requiring hands as much as feet in places. The grey mare balked at first, reluctant to tackle slopes that looked more suited to mountain goats than horses. But Itu coaxed her forward with gentle words in Blackfoot, and the loyal animal followed where her human led. As they climbed, Takoda fell into step beside Catherine, offering a hand when the footing grew particularly difficult. "You fight well for a white woman," she said, not unkindly. "Where did you learn?" "I didn't," Catherine admitted. "I just did what seemed necessary to stay alive. That's all fighting ever is," Takoda said. "People make it complicated with rules and honor and proper technique. But at the end it's simple. You do what's necessary or you die." She glanced at Catherine sidelong. "My cousin chose well. You have a survivor's heart." "I'm not sure that's a compliment," Catherine said. "It's the highest one I know," Takoda replied. They reached Eagle's Rest as the sun reached its zenith, bathing the high country in harsh white light. The place was exactly as Itu had described it, a natural fortress carved by wind and time into the mountain's bones. Massive boulders formed walls on 3 sides, with only one narrow approach that could be easily defended. A spring bubbled up from between rocks, its water so cold it hurt to drink, but pure and endless. And everywhere were the marks of old fires, old camps, proof that Etu's people had used this place for generations. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 12, Itu said, looking around with something like reverence in his face. "Told me to sit and wait until the spirit spoke. I sat for 3 days without food or water, waiting for visions." He smiled faintly. "Never got any visions, just very hungry and very thirsty. But I learned patience. You'll need it now," Takoda said, already setting up defensive positions. She placed rifles at strategic points, counted ammunition, arranged everything with the efficiency of someone who'd prepared ambushes before. "If Garrison is smart, he'll wait until dark and try to sneak close. If he's stupid, he'll attack before then and lose more men." "He's arrogant, not stupid," Itu said. "He'll wait. Use the time to bring up those reinforcements he mentioned. Try to overwhelm us with numbers." Catherine sat down on a flat rock, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that they'd reached relative safety. Her feet throbbed despite the healing. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, and every muscle in her body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. But she was alive. Against all odds, against all reason, she was still breathing. "Why did you come?" she asked Takoda. "You said the elders want Itu to come home, but you didn't have to follow him into a war." Takoda settled onto a rock nearby, checking her rifle's action with absent competence. "I came because he's family," she said simply. "When I heard he'd finally stopped running, finally chosen to stand for something, I knew I had to be here. Besides," she added with a grin, "I haven't killed anyone in months. I was getting bored." Catherine couldn't tell if she was joking. "Probably not," she decided. "Tell me about the elders," Catherine said. "Tell me about exile and redemption. I want to understand." Takoda considered for a moment, her grey eyes distant. "Our people have laws older than memory. Some are about survival, about how to live in a hard land. Others are about honor, about what separates us from animals. Itu broke one of the deepest laws when he killed in vengeance rather than defense. The elders had no choice but to exile him." She paused. "But exile was never meant to be forever. It was meant to be a teaching, a space for reflection and growth. 10 years is a long teaching. And now they want him back?" Catherine asked. "Now they see he's learned," Takoda said. "A man who runs from his guilt learns nothing. A man who faces it, who chooses to stand again despite his fear of failing, that man has become wise." She looked at Itu, who was positioning himself at the narrow entrance to their fortress. "He thinks he's unredeemable. He thinks he failed Ayana so completely that he doesn't deserve another chance. But the elders see different. They see a man who's paid his debt and earned his way home. Catherine watched Itu standing guard. This man who'd inserted himself into her nightmare for no reason except that he'd failed someone else a decade ago. She thought about redemption, about second chances, about whether any amount of suffering could erase past mistakes. She didn't have answers. But she knew that whatever happened on this mountain, Etu Strongbow had already redeemed himself in the only court that truly mattered, his own conscience. The afternoon stretched long and tense. They took turns keeping watch, two awake while one rested, though none of them truly slept. Catherine found herself talking with Takoda during their watch together, learning about the Blackfoot way of life, about a culture that white settlers had tried to destroy but hadn't quite managed to break. Takoda spoke of her daughter, of teaching the girl to track and hunt, of passing on knowledge that might otherwise be lost. "You should teach her to read and write too," Catherine said. "The world is changing. She'll need both kinds of knowledge to survive." "I know," Takoda said quietly. "That's why we're fighting here. Not just for you, though you're worth fighting for, but because men like Vincent Garrison represent everything that's destroying my people. They take and take and take, and they kill anyone who resists. If we let them win here, if we let them silence you, we're saying their way is the only way. I won't accept that." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Itu called them together. "They're moving," he said, pointing down the mountain. Catherine followed his gesture and saw movement in the rocks below, men spreading out, taking positions. More than before. Vincent Garrison had brought his reinforcements. How many? Takoda asked. "At least 15, Etu said grimly. "Maybe 20. He's committed everything." Catherine felt her stomach drop. 20 men against 3, one of whom was a woman who could barely walk without pain. The mathematics were impossible. "We can't fight that many," she said. "No," Etu agreed. "We can't, not directly." He looked at his cousin. "Remember that canyon north of here? The one that floods every spring?" Takoda's eyes widened with understanding. "The narrow one with the log dam? The one holding back all that snowmelt?" "Ah, that's the one," Itu said. "If someone were to break that dam right now, all that water would come rushing down the mountain, right through the canyon where Garrison's men are positioning themselves." "That's murder," Catherine said, shocked. "That's war," Takoda corrected. "They came here to kill us. We're simply choosing the battlefield." Catherine looked between them, these two warriors from a culture she barely understood, calmly discussing drowning 20 men as if it were a tactical problem rather than a moral crisis. Part of her recoiled at the coldness of it, but another part, the part that had thrown stones and watched men die, understood the brutal necessity. If they didn't act, they would die. It was that simple. How long to reach the dam? Catherine asked. Itu looked surprised that she was considering it. "An hour there, an hour back. If we move fast, then we need to move now," Catherine said, "before they get into position for an assault." Takoda grinned, fierce and approving. "I knew I liked you." She stood, gathering her rifle and ammunition. "I'll go. I'm fastest—" "No," Etu said. "I know the dam's construction. I helped build it years ago. I know exactly where to strike to bring it down clean and leave us here alone." Takoda protested. "You're the better shot," Etu said. "If they attack while I'm gone, Catherine needs you more than she needs me." He was already moving, checking his knife, his resolve clear. Catherine grabbed his arm, stopping him. "If you don't come back," she started, but couldn't finish the sentence. Etu covered her hand with his, the gesture surprisingly gentle. "I'll come back," he said. "I have something to live for now." That makes all the difference. Then he was gone, disappearing into the rocks with that same fluid grace she'd seen before. And Catherine was left with Takoda and the grey mare, and the sound of men advancing up the mountain toward their position. The sun hung low and blood-red over the mountains, painting the rocks in shades of copper and rust that made the whole world look like it was burning. Catherine crouched behind a boulder at the entrance to Eagle's Rest, rifle in hand, watching the shadows below lengthen and twist as Vincent Garrison's men continued their careful advance. Beside her, Takoda sat with the patience of stone, her own rifle resting across her knees. her grey eyes tracking movement that Catherine couldn't yet perceive. "They're being smart now," Dakota murmured, not taking her eyes from the slope below. "No more rushing, no more grouping together. They're spreading out, using cover properly. Someone down there knows what they're doing." Catherine peered over the boulder's edge, trying to see what Dakota saw. After a moment, she caught it. A flash of movement between rocks, the briefest glimpse of a man crawling from one position to another. Then another flash, 30 yards to the left. Then another to the right. They were encircling the position, patient and methodical, closing like a noose. "How long before they're in range?" Catherine asked, keeping her voice low. "They're already in range for a good rifle," Dakota replied. "But they won't attack until dark. They'll wait for the sun to set. Let the shadows work for them. Give them cover to get close." She glanced at the sky, calculating. "Maybe 30 minutes. Maybe less, 30 minutes before Garrison's men attacked. And Etu had been gone for nearly an hour already, which meant he should be at the dam by now, should be working to bring it down. But that was the best case. If he'd encountered problems, if the dam proved harder to break than he'd anticipated, if any of 100 things went wrong, he might not make it back before the assault began. "Tell me about him," Catherine said suddenly, needing to fill the waiting with words. With anything except the slow crawl of dread up her spine. "Tell me about Etu before the exile. What was he like?" "Nah." Dakota was quiet for a moment, and Catherine thought maybe she wouldn't answer. Then the Blackfoot woman smiled, an expression that softened her fierce features into something almost tender. "He was different then. Lighter, if that makes sense. He laughed easily, made jokes that weren't always appropriate. The young women all wanted him because he was handsome and brave and just arrogant enough to be interesting." She paused, memory playing across her face. Ayana was good for him. She grounded him, made him think before he acted. When she died, it was like watching a fire go out. Catherine absorbed this, trying to imagine the man she'd met as someone who laughed easily, who had been young and arrogant and full of life. The Etu she knew carried 10 years of grief like a physical weight, every movement careful, every word measured. "Do you think he can go back?" she asked. "Really go back, I mean. Not just to your people, but to being that person again?" "No," Dakota said simply. "That Etu died with Ayana, but maybe he can become someone new, someone who's seen darkness and survived it, who knows the weight of failure and chose to stand anyway." She looked at Catherine directly. "You've given him that chance. Whatever happens here, whatever comes after, you've shown him that standing matters. That's no small gift." Before Catherine could respond, movement below caught her eye. Not the careful stalking she'd been seeing, but something different. A figure was approaching openly, walking up the trail without attempting cover, hands raised to show he carried no weapons. As he drew closer, Catherine recognized Vincent Garrison himself, still wearing that expensive coat, still looking more like a banker than a killer. "He's coming under a flag of truce," Dakota said, her voice tight with suspicion. "Or what? Passes for one in his world." "Should we shoot him?" Catherine asked, surprised by how easily the question came. "We could," Dakota replied. "End this right now. But he's not stupid enough to come alone without insurance. His men probably have orders to attack immediately if he goes down. And besides," she added with grim pragmatism, "I want to hear what he has to say." Garrison stopped about 50 yards from their position, well within rifle range, but far enough to give himself a chance to run if shooting started. He was breathing hard from the climb, his face flushed, but his voice when he called out was steady and controlled. "Miss Vale," he said, addressing Catherine directly, "I think it's time we talked. Just you and me, reasonable people having a reasonable conversation." "There's nothing reasonable about murder," Catherine called back, her voice stronger than she felt. "You killed Thomas Brennan in cold blood. You killed Samuel Chen for giving me shelter. You hanged Jack Morley for offering me a horse. You don't get to pretend you're reasonable." Garrison's face tightened. but he kept his voice level. Marshal. Brennan was investigating matters that didn't concern him. He was warned multiple times to back off. He chose to keep digging. That was his decision. His decision was to enforce the law. Catherine shot back. Your decision was to put a bullet in him rather than face justice. Justice, Garrison repeated, and now his voice held contempt. You mean the justice of courts 1,000 miles away? Judges who've never set foot in this territory? Bureaucrats who don't understand how things work out here? This is the frontier, Miss Vale. It has its own rules, its own justice. I built an empire in this wilderness, brought order to chaos, created prosperity where there was only poverty. And yes, sometimes that required hard choices. Choices that soft Eastern sensibilities might not approve of, but choices that were necessary. Necessary, Catherine said, tasting the word like poison. Is that what you call stealing land from? Families? Burning out homesteaders? Murdering anyone who challenges you? You're not bringing order, Garrison. You're bringing tyranny. Garrison's mask of reasonableness slipped, revealing the cold fury beneath. You self-righteous little fool. You think you're fighting for something noble, but you're just a clerk who saw something she shouldn't have. You're not a hero, you're an inconvenience, and I'm offering you a way out. I don't want a way out, Catherine said. Not for yourself, Garrison continued. For the people who'll die if you keep fighting. I have 20 men down here, Miss Vale. Good men, most of them, just trying to earn wages to feed their families. Keep this up, and how many of them die? How many widows do you want to make? How many orphans? He paused, letting the words sink in. But it doesn't have to be that way. Come down, come with me. Testify that Brennan's death was an accident, a misunderstanding. I'll see that you're well compensated for your cooperation. $50,000, enough to start a new life anywhere you want. And all these men get to go home to their families. Catherine felt the weight of his words, the twisted logic that tried to make her responsible for the violence he'd brought to this mountain. She looked at Takoda, whose expression was contemptuous, then back at Garrison. You're lying, she said. Even if I testified the way you want, you'd kill me the moment I was no longer useful. And you'd kill Etu and Takoda just for good measure. Probably, Garrison admitted with shocking casualness, but at least you'd live a little longer. Buy yourself a few more days, maybe weeks. Isn't that better than dying here in the next hour? No, Catherine said, and felt certainty settle over her like a mantle. No, it's not, because those days would be spent knowing I'd betrayed everything Thomas Brennan died for, knowing I'd let you win. I'd rather die here right now, knowing I fought back. Garrison stared at her for a long moment, and Catherine saw something flicker in his eyes. Not respect exactly, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement of her resolve. Then his face hardened into something cruel and final. So be it, he said. I gave you a chance. What happens now is on your conscience. No, Catherine replied. It's on yours. It's always been on yours. Garrison turned and walked back down the slope, his expensive coat swirling behind him. When he reached his men, Catherine saw him gesturing, giving orders. The men began moving with new urgency, abandoning their patient stalking for aggressive positioning. The assault was coming, and it was coming soon. That went well, Takoda said dryly. Should I have agreed? Catherine asked, sudden doubt gnawing at her. Should I have tried to buy time? He was never going to let you live, Takoda said firmly. You know too much, and he's too proud to forgive your defiance. If you'd agreed, he would have killed you as soon as you descended. At least this way, you'd die on your feet. She checked her rifle, her movements precise and professional. And who knows, maybe we don't die at all. Maybe your Blackfoot warrior pulls off a miracle. He's not my Blackfoot warrior, Catherine protested. Isn't he? Takoda asked, one eyebrow raised. He chose to stand for you. That creates a bond, whether you want it or not. In my culture, that makes him responsible for your life, and you responsible for honoring his sacrifice if it comes to that. Catherine didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to process the idea that she'd become bound to E2 Strongbow through violence and shared survival. So she said nothing, just gripped her rifle tighter and watched the shadows lengthen as the sun touched the western peaks. The attack came as twilight bled into darkness, that uncertain time when shapes became ambiguous and distance became impossible to judge. It came not as a coordinated assault, but as a sudden rush from multiple directions, men materializing from shadows and charging up the slope with weapons ready. Takoda fired first, her shot dropping a man 20 yards from their position. Catherine fired a heartbeat later, missed, worked the bolt and fired again. This time she hit, saw a man stumble and fall. The noise was overwhelming, rifle fire echoing off the rocks, men shouting, bullets striking stone and throwing up chips that stung like hornets. Catherine fired mechanically, not thinking, just finding targets and pulling the trigger, watching men advance and fall and advance again. Beside her, Takoda was a machine of efficiency, every shot carefully placed, every bullet accounting for itself. But there were too many. For every man they dropped, 2 more took his place. The garrison men reached the outer rocks of Eagles. Rest too close now for rifle work, close enough that Catherine could see their faces, contorted with effort and fear and murderous intent. One man reached the top of the boulder Catherine was sheltering behind, his pistol coming around to bear on her. She swung her rifle like a club, too panicked to aim, and caught him across the face. He fell backward with a scream, tumbling down. "The rocks! Fall back!" Takoda shouted, already moving deeper into the fortress. "To the center by the spring!" Catherine scrambled after her, her wounded feet screaming protest, bullets chewing up the ground where she'd been standing moments before. They reached the spring, a natural depression surrounded by waist-high rocks, and took cover. From here they had clear lines of sight to all approaches, but they were also cornered. If the garrison men kept pressing, there would be nowhere left to retreat. A man appeared at the entrance they'd just abandoned, rifle raised. Takoda shot him before he could fire. Another came from the left, and Catherine's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. But they kept coming, wave after wave, driven by Vincent Garrison's will and the promise of payment. Catherine's ammunition was running low. She could feel it in the lightness of her cartridge belt, count it in the diminishing weight of her pockets. Maybe 10 rounds left. Maybe fewer. "This is it," Takoda said, and there was no fear in her voice, only acceptance. "When I run out of bullets, I'll use my knife. You should do the same. Make them earn it." Catherine felt a strange calm settle over her. She was going to die here, on this mountain, surrounded by men who wanted her silenced. But she wouldn't die quietly. She wouldn't die begging. She'd die fighting, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could ask for. Then she heard it, distant but growing louder, a sound like thunder, like the earth itself tearing open. The roar built and built, echoing off the mountains, making the ground beneath her feet tremble. Takoda's head snapped up, her eyes widening with recognition and fierce joy. "He did it," she breathed. "The dam. He actually did it." The sound grew to a crescendo, and then Catherine saw it. A wall of water 20 feet high, white with foam and fury, roaring down the canyon below Eagle's Rest like the fist of an angry god. It caught the garrison men completely by surprise, men who'd been focused on the assault, suddenly looking down to see death rushing toward them. Some tried to run. None made it. The flood swept them away like toys, horses and men together, tumbling them in the churning water, smashing them against rocks, dragging them down into the brutal current. The roar lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Then it was past, continuing its destructive path down the mountain, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Where there had been a trail, there was now a river. Where there had been 20 armed men, there was now only water and debris, and the occasional hand reaching up from the flood before being pulled under. Catherine stared in horror at the devastation, her mind struggling to process what she'd just witnessed. An entire force erased in seconds. Men who'd been shooting at her moments ago, now dead or dying in the water below. She'd wanted to survive, had been willing to fight for that survival. But this wholesale slaughter felt like something different, something that crossed lines she hadn't known existed. "Don't," Takoda said quietly, reading her expression. "Don't mourn them. They came here to kill us. Itu gave them the death they intended for us. That's justice, not murder." "It doesn't feel like justice," Catherine whispered. "It never does," Takoda replied. "Justice is clean in stories. In life, it's always messy, always complicated. But those men made their choices. They chose to follow Vincent Garrison. They chose to hunt you. They chose to attack us. Itu just made sure their choices had consequences." Movement on the rocks above caught Catherine's attention. A figure was descending toward them, moving carefully over wet stone, and after a moment she recognized Itu. He looked exhausted, soaked to the skin, his clothes torn, and his face marked with cuts and bruises. But he was alive, and when he saw them standing by the spring, relief washed over his features. "You survived," he said simply. "So did you," Catherine replied. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask about the dam, about the men he'd just killed, about the weight of what he'd done. But the words wouldn't come. Itu seemed to understand. He moved to the edge of the rocks and looked down at the flood-scoured canyon below. His expression was unreadable, but Catherine saw his hands trembling slightly. "The dam was old," he said quietly. "I knew exactly where to strike to bring it down. It took maybe 10 minutes to weaken the supports enough." He paused. "I heard the attack start while I was working. Heard the rifles. I thought I might be too late." "You weren't," Takoda said, moving to stand beside her cousin. "You were exactly on time." "As usual." Itu managed a weak smile at that, but it faded quickly. "Did any of them survive?" Takoda shook her head. "I don't think so. The water was too strong, too sudden. They didn't have a chance." "Good," Itu said, and the flatness in his voice sent a chill down Catherine's spine. This wasn't the man she'd come to know, the one who spoke about decency and second chances. This was someone else, someone shaped by necessity into something harder. "What about Vincent Garrison? Did you see him in the flood?" "No," Catherine said, and felt her stomach drop. "I didn't. He might have been at the back, might have been somewhere the water didn't reach." Itu's jaw tightened. "Then it's not over." As if summoned by his words, a voice called up from the darkness below, carrying across the water-ravaged canyon with eerie clarity. "Strongbow! You listening, Mudai?" It was Vincent Garrison, alive and furious, his cultivated reasonableness burned away by rage. "You killed my men, you red savage. 20 good men drowned like rats. I'll see you hang for this. I'll see you all hang. You'll have to catch us first," Itu called back. "Oh, I'll catch you," Garrison promised. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow. But I own this territory, Strongbow. I own the law, the judges, the marshals. I'll put bounties on your head so high that every gun in Montana will be hunting you. You'll never know a moment's peace. You'll never be safe. And when I finally catch you, I'll make sure you die slow." Itu didn't respond immediately. He looked at Catherine, then at Takoda, reading something in their faces. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "You can try, Garrison. But I've been running for 10 years. I know how to disappear. And now I have something you don't—" "What's that?" Garrison demanded. "A reason to keep fighting," Itu said. "Men with nothing to lose are dangerous, but men with something to protect? We're unstoppable." Silence followed, broken only by the rush of water through the canyon below. Then Garrison's voice came again, quieter now, almost reflective. "This isn't over, Strongbow. Not by a long shot." "No," Itu agreed. "It's not." They waited in the darkness, listening, but no more words came from below. Eventually, they heard the sound of a horse moving away, picking carefully through the transformed landscape. Vincent Garrison was retreating, wounded and alone, his army destroyed. But Catherine knew Itu was right. This wasn't over. A man like Garrison didn't forgive, didn't forget. He'd return with more men, more resources, more determination. "We need to leave," Takoda said, already beginning to gather their remaining supplies. Get as far from here as possible before he brings reinforcements. Where? Catherine asked. Where can we possibly go that he won't find us? Betu and Takoda exchanged another of those wordless communications. Then Etu turned to Catherine, and she saw something new in his face. Not resignation, not determination, but something that looked almost like hope. Home, he said simply. We go home. They left Eagle's Rest before dawn, moving through darkness so complete it felt like traveling through the belly of the earth itself. The grey mare carried Catherine, her wrapped feet too damaged for walking the treacherous mountain paths, while Etu and Takoda moved on foot with the ease of people born to this landscape. They traveled north, away from the water-ravaged canyon, away from the death and destruction, heading towards something Catherine didn't fully understand, but found herself trusting anyway. The journey took 3 days of hard travel through country that grew wilder with each mile. They moved through forests so dense the sunlight barely penetrated, across rivers swollen with snowmelt that soaked them to the bone, over passes where the wind cut like knives and the air grew thin enough to make breathing an effort. Catherine's body screamed protest at every step the mare took, but she gritted her teeth and endured. She'd survived worse. She'd survived everything Vincent Garrison had thrown at her, and she'd be damned if she'd let mere physical pain defeat her now. On the second night, camped in a grove of ancient pines with a small fire that Etu kept carefully shielded, Catherine finally asked the question that had been building in her mind. What happens when we reach your people? Will they accept me? A white woman who brought death to their doorstep? Etu looked up from the rabbit he was skinning, his hands steady despite the difficult work. They'll judge you by your actions, not your skin. You fought beside us. You refused to surrender when surrender would have been easier. That matters to my people. Honor matters, but I'm still the reason Vincent Garrison knows about you now, Catherine persisted. I'm still the reason he'll keep hunting. How long before he traces us to your village? How long before he brings his violence there? He won't find us, Takoda said from across the fire. She was working on her rifle, cleaning it with practiced care. The winter camps move with the seasons. By the time Garrison figures out where to look, we'll be somewhere else. And if he does find us, he'll discover that attacking a Blackfoot camp is very different from hunting one woman through the mountains. Catherine wanted to believe that, wanted to think that reaching Etu's people meant safety, meant an end to running. But she'd learned too much about Vincent Garrison's reach, his resources, his stubborn refusal to accept defeat. There's another option, Catherine said quietly. I could leave, head east, try to reach a federal court, testify against Garrison where he doesn't own the judges. If I'm not with you, he has no reason to hunt your people. No, Etu said, his voice flat and final. It makes sense, Catherine argued. I'm the witness he wants silenced. Take me out of the equation and you die before you make it 100 miles, Etu interrupted. Garrison has contacts in every town, every fort, every staging post between here and civilization. The moment you show your face, someone will recognize you. You'd be dead within a week. He's right, Takoda added. Alone, you're vulnerable. With us, you have protection. With our people, you have an entire tribe between you and Garrison's hired killers. It's not charity, Catherine. It's survival. Catherine stared into the fire, watching flames consume wood, turning solid matter into ash and smoke. She'd been running for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have a destination rather than just a direction away from danger. The idea of stopping, of staying somewhere, of being part of something larger than her own desperate flight, felt foreign and frightening and strangely appealing. What will I do there? She asked. In your village, I mean. I'm a clerk. I file papers and keep records. I don't know how to hunt or track or survive in the wilderness. You can read and write, Takoda said. You can keep records, help negotiate with traders, teach the children. The world is changing, Catherine. My people need bridges to that new world, people who understand both ways of living. You could be that bridge. If they'll accept me, Catherine said, they will, Etu said with quiet certainty. Because I'll ask them to. And after 10 years of exile, after everything that's happened, they'll listen. On the third day, as they climbed over a final ridge and began their descent into a broad valley, Takoda suddenly stopped and pointed. "There," she said, and Catherine heard pride and relief mixed in her voice. "Home." Catherine looked where she was pointing and saw smoke rising from perhaps 30 lodges scattered along a river that cut through the valley like a silver ribbon. People moved among the structures, small figures from this distance, but clearly alive, clearly thriving. It looked peaceful, almost impossibly so after the violence of the past week. It looked like something from another world. A world where men like Vincent Garrison didn't exist, and death didn't follow you like a shadow. "It's beautiful," Catherine whispered. "It's survival," Takoda corrected. "Beauty is just a side effect." As they descended into the valley, people began to notice their approach. First one, then another, then suddenly a dozen people were moving toward them. Some cautious, some curious, all clearly surprised to see Etu Strongbow returning after 10 years of exile. An old woman reached them first, her face a map of wrinkles, but her eyes sharp and clear. She studied Etu for a long moment, then spoke in Blackfoot, her voice carrying authority. Etu responded in the same language, his tone respectful, almost humble. The exchange went back and forth for several minutes while Catherine sat on the mare, feeling awkward and conspicuous. Finally, the old woman turned her attention to Catherine, looking her up and down with an expression that revealed nothing. "She's asking who you are," Takoda translated. "What you are to Etu?" Catherine hesitated, not sure how to answer. What was she to Etu? A woman he'd chosen to save? A burden he'd taken on? Something more complicated that neither of them had words for. "Tell her I'm someone he helped," Catherine said finally. "Someone who would have died without him," Takoda translated, and the old woman's expression softened slightly. She spoke again, and Takoda's translation came with a smile. "She says any friend of Etu Strongbow is welcome here. She says you have the look of someone who's fought hard to survive, and survivors are always valued among our people." An older man pushed through the crowd, his hair white, but his bearing still strong and commanding. When he spoke, everyone fell silent, and Catherine knew without being told that this was someone important. He addressed Etu directly, his voice grave, and Etu responded with equal gravity. The exchange went on for some time, with Takoda occasionally interjecting. "That's Runs with Elk," Takoda explained quietly. "The one who sentenced Etu to exile 10 years ago. He's asking Etu to explain his actions, to justify breaking exile without permission. Etu is telling him about you, about the garrisons, about choosing to stand instead of run." Catherine watched Etu's face as he responded, saw something raw and honest in his expression. When he finished speaking, Runs with Elk was quiet for a long moment. Then the old man did something unexpected. He smiled, reached out, and placed both hands on Etu's shoulders in a gesture that was clearly significant. He spoke again, and this time his voice was warm, welcoming. "He's lifting the exile," Takoda said, and Catherine heard the catch in her voice. "He says Etu has paid his debt, learned his lessons, and earned the right to come home. He says the man who rode away 10 years ago was broken by grief and rage, but the man who stands here now has been remade by sacrifice and honor." Catherine saw Etu's shoulders sag, 10 years of weight lifting all at once. He responded in Blackfoot, his voice rough with emotion, and Runs with Elk pulled him into an embrace that looked like it was healing something deep and old. Around them, the people began to murmur approval, the tension dissipating into something warmer, more accepting. Over the next hours, Catherine was introduced to what felt like the entire village. Takoda's daughter, a fierce-eyed girl named Ayana after Etu's dead wife, studied Catherine with undisguised interest. An elder woman named Singing Bird, who spoke broken English, immediately began fussing over Catherine's wounded feet, applying new salves with gentle competence. As evening fell, the tribe gathered for a feast. Fires were built, food was prepared, and suddenly Catherine found herself sitting on soft furs, surrounded by people speaking a language she didn't understand. eating food she couldn't identify and feeling more at home than she had in months. It made no sense, but they'd welcomed her anyway, accepted her because Etu had asked them to. Etu sat beside her, and in the firelight he looked different, younger somehow, as if the weight he'd carried for a decade had finally been set down. He caught her looking and smiled. "You're staring," he said. "You look happy," Catherine replied. "It's strange seeing you happy." "I forgot what it felt like," Etu admitted. "I forgot what it meant to belong somewhere. I thought I'd lost this forever." But Dakota was right. 10 years was enough. The elders saw that. He turned to look at her directly. "You saved me as much as I saved you, Catherine. Maybe more." Before Catherine could respond, Runs with Elk stood and called for attention. The gathered people fell silent. The old man spoke in Blackfoot, and Catherine caught Etu's name and her own. When he finished, the people made sounds of approval, a rhythmic chanting. "What did he say?" Catherine asked. "He told them your story," Etu replied. "About Thomas Brennan, about the garrisons, about how you refused to submit. He said you have a warrior's heart and that the tribe will protect you as one of their own. It's a binding promise. They're making you one of us." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. She'd lost everything in the past weeks, but here she'd found something unexpected: acceptance, protection, maybe even family. The feast continued late into the night. Catherine's exhaustion finally overwhelmed her, and Singing Bird guided her to a lodge, making sure she was comfortable before leaving her to rest. Catherine lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the camp settling down, trying to process everything. Less than a week ago, she'd been alone and dying. Now she was here among people who'd chosen to protect her. The lodge flap opened, and Etu ducked inside, moving quietly. When he saw her eyes open, he paused. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Dakota said you should have someone nearby. In case of nightmares." "I'm not asleep yet," Catherine said. "Too much in my head." Etu settled on the opposite side of the fire. "It's a lot to absorb. Give yourself time." "Do we have time?" Catherine asked. "Garrison is still out there. How long before he finds us?" "Longer than you think," Etu replied. "This valley is remote. The trails are deliberately obscured. If Garrison's men come, we'll know long before they arrive. People will die because of me," Catherine said. "Then don't carry them alone," Etu said. "Share the weight. That's what community means. I carried Ayana's death alone for 10 years, and it nearly destroyed me. Let these people help you carry yours." "I'm scared," Catherine admitted. "Good," Etu said. "Fear keeps you alive. Sleep now. Tomorrow, we'll start teaching you what you need to know. You'll never be helpless again." The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Catherine learned to mend nets and tan hides, to identify edible plants, to speak basic Blackfoot phrases. Etu and Dakota spent hours teaching her to shoot properly, to move through forest without sound. 3 weeks after their arrival, scouts brought news. White men had been seen in the foothills, asking questions, offering money for information. Vincent Garrison was still hunting. A council was called. Runs with Elk asked, should they move the camp or stand their ground? The debate went on for hours. Finally, he turned to Catherine. "You are the one Garrison hunts. What do you believe we should do?" Catherine thought about running, about standing, about justice. "I believe we should send word to the federal marshals," she said. "Not the territorial ones Garrison owns, but the ones from back east. Tell them what happened, offer my testimony in a proper court, and if the marshals don't come." Runs with Elk asked, "Then we fight," Catherine said simply. "We make Garrison pay so dearly that eventually even his pride can't justify the cost." Runs with Elk smiled, fierce and approving. "Then we send word, and we prepare for war." The messenger rode out the next morning. It would take weeks to reach anyone who mattered. In that time, Garrison's killers might find them. But Catherine felt like she was finally fighting back. As winter's first snow began to fall, Catherine stood outside her lodge. Etu approached and stood beside her. "Regrets?" Catherine thought about the question. She'd lost her old life, but she'd gained strength, purpose, belonging. She'd found people who valued her courage. She'd found home. "No," she said. No regrets. Etu nodded. Good, because whatever comes next, we face it together. That's what family does. The snow fell harder, covering the valley in white silence. Somewhere Vincent Garrison was plotting. Federal marshals were reading her testimony. The future was uncertain, dangerous. But Catherine Vale was no longer running. She was standing her ground, surrounded by people who'd chosen to protect her. Whatever came next, she would face it. She would fight. And she would survive, because that's what warriors did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.